In medieval times, how did people survive the severe winter? How did they manage with heat, food, clothing, and shelter? With dark, harsh weather outside, how did they keep themselves entertained? During the Middle Ages, winter was more than dealing with bad weather. It was truly a struggle to live for another year. The life of the average peasant was just a shade worse than dreadful. It's freezing cold, you're running out of food, and worst of all, there's absolutely nothing to do. Life in the Middle Ages was harsh, brutal, and short. The onset of the Little Ice Age, around 1300 until roughly 1870, meant that the long, dark winters of this period were colder and more dangerous, with starvation and death from illness and the cold common. Surviving winter in the Middle Ages wasn't about comfort, it was about endurance. Peasants in the villages worked tirelessly during the warmer months to stockpile food, firewood, and supplies, but no amount of preparation could eliminate the biting cold or the relentless hunger. Crops were often impossible to grow under the frost-covered soil, and families huddled together in drafty stone or timber homes. A fire, which provided heat as well as a place for cooking, was often central to the home, with ventilation holes in the roof rather than a chimney. Sometimes there would be a second floor, which would be reached by a ladder and used for storage. Tables and beds would be in the main area around the fire. If you had any livestock, well, they'll be sleeping right next to you. Fireplaces provided some relief, but wood was precious, and burning too much too soon could mean freezing to death later. Meat could be preserved with salt, but the cost of salt often made it a luxury, leaving poorer households to survive on root vegetables, porridge, and bread. And if they didn't have enough grain, tough luck. By late winter, families sometimes mixed sawdust or dried beans into their flour to stretch what little they had left. Soups and stews were common, simmering endlessly over the hearth, using every last scrap of bone or vegetable to create something warm and filling. Frostbite, illness, and famine were constant threats. Villagers relied on community and ingenuity to survive. They mended clothes with scraps, stuffed straw into walls for insulation, and shared what little they had with neighbours in need. To combat the bitter cold, clothing became their armour against the season. People layered themselves in woolen garments, as wool was one of the few materials that could retain warmth even when damp. But wool was not enough for everyone. Those with means wore cloaks lined with fur. Fox, rabbit, or, for the wealthiest, ermine. While the poor often made do with patched-up cloaks and layers of rough linen. Shoes were stuffed with straw for insulation, but even this was a losing battle when trudging through icy mud or snow. Gloves were rare luxuries, so hands were wrapped in strips of cloth, and hoods were pulled low to shield faces from icy winds. Superstitions thrived during these dark months, where long nights and howling wind seemed to draw the unseen closer. Villagers believed that winter was a time when spirits and witches roamed freely, drawn to the quiet and cold. But they were not helpless against these forces. Herbs like garlic and rosemary were hung over doorways to ward off evil, and candles burned to keep spirits at bay. Children were told not to wander too far after dark, lest they be snatched away by fairies or frost demons. Therefore, rituals and customs became a part of daily life. Families would leave small offerings, perhaps a piece of bread or a cup of ale, on their doorstep to appease wandering spirits. Even animals weren't left out. Horses and livestock were sometimes blessed by priests to protect them from illness during the winter. Once all the chores were done, people had to find some way of passing the time to avoid going crazy. Not a lot of agricultural work could be done in the winter, so a lot of time was spent indoors. Time was spent spinning wool, telling stories, and playing games such as chess and backgammon. Winter was such a novelty that children and adults alike would engage in snowball fights. In Viking communities, these fights were seen as a great way to train children for future battles. If you had buttons, you'd have buttoned up. For the first time in living memory, rivers and streams froze solid. People would skate using animal bones as ice skates. Skates would later be made from iron. Paintings of these wintry scenes were everywhere, as nobody had ever seen anything like it before. But why was it so cold all of a sudden? Nobody knows for sure. Maybe it was caused by volcanic activity or lack of sunspots. Starting around 1300, ice packs from the Arctic started moving south. That's when Greenland stopped being green. It was no longer possible to grow vines north of France, so that was the end of the English wine industry. In the monasteries, chroniclers stopped spreading rumours about what the local abbot was up to and started writing things like, "By God, it's cold." It wasn't just northern Europe that was affected. On the mainland, the River Rhine in Germany froze for 70 days. This allowed the town of Cologne to hold a market on the icy river. Even the Venetian lagoon froze. Despite their best efforts, winter remained a season of endurance. But in the midst of the struggle, there were moments of warmth and community. Storytelling by the fire kept spirits alive, while shared meals reminded them of the bonds that held villages together. Although winter was harsh, it also forged resilience, ingenuity, and traditions that would be passed down through generations.